It currently stands at 112 terawatt hours annualized. And that's best guess estimate, of course, because we provide the lower bound, upper bound, and best guess estimate. If I check lower and upper bounds, they are so electricity estimate is anywhere between 37.6 terawatt hours and 290 terawatt hours.
So we often hear these numbers compared to countries, Anton. Bitcoin is equivalent to, say, Sweden, which sounds really big. But is that a reasonable comparison? How does Bitcoin compare to, say, other types of energy uses, or we might say misuses of energy?
Mm-hmm. So we not only calculate electricity consumption, but we also tried to put these figures into perspective, because just 100 or 200, it doesn't mean anything unless you put it into perspective. And country comparison was just one of these comparisons. By far the most popular, of course, because that's the easiest one to understand. But if we compare it to countries, it indeed looks big. But if we compare it to all countries, for example, looking at the United States and Chinese consumption, you'll hardly see Bitcoin in this chart. So it depends to wasted energy or energy used in recreational purposes. You can also have a different angle on it. And another important thing to consider here, how much electricity traditional financial system consumes. We don't have a reliable estimate this far, but it is definitely a figure of the same order of magnitude.
So, I think these comparisons can be productive, but they're often really apples to zucchini, and they don't only tell us so much. And perhaps the more important measure is how much of this is coming from renewable sources. So, Meltem, is it possible to measure that?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me, Sheila. I think that's exactly the question. I used to work in the energy industry before I started working in the Bitcoin industry, and there are two conversations we need to have here. One is around the sources of energy. And at the end of the day, my computer's plugged into my wall right now. I don't dictate what my sources of energy are. The grid dictates that. And in most countries, the grid is not centrally planned. There are a variety of economic incentives and market incentives that predicate and dictate the type of energy production that exists on that grid. So we really need to separate the argument into its two components. If we want to talk about the sources of energy, that is very difficult to track. Unless a mining facility is directly co-located with renewable energy production, it is very challenging for any miner plugged into the grid to verify where the electrons they're using are coming from. However, this is a trend we're seeing and a trend we track at Coinshares. In 2018, we published one of the first bottoms-up industry research reports where our research team actually spent 6 months interviewing, talking to, calling miners to find out what machines they were running, where they were running them, and we've collaborated closely with Cambridge over the years. So we've shared a lot of our pains on trying to gather this data. And that's how we were able to confirm that over 70% of Bitcoin mining was in fact done with renewables, in particular hydroelectric power from the Sichuan region of China, because miners will actually physically co-locate next to a hydroelectric facility and plug the miners into that renewable power source. But I think the challenge starts to become, we're talking here about sources of energy. On the topic of uses of energy, it's very difficult to have a conversation about the uses of energy that's objective. It's highly subjective. I could say Christmas lights are a terrible use of energy, and every year Christmas lights consume more energy than the Bitcoin network. I could say hair dryers are a bad use of energy. So it's very difficult. And the country comparison, I think, is fraught with some challenges. Again, the Bitcoin network today secures over $1 trillion worth of value. Proof of work is what secures that $1 trillion worth of value. Do you put $1 trillion economy on par with, a $500 billion economy? Probably. So I think when we start getting into these comparative discussions around uses of energy, it's very difficult to have an objective conversation. And so the challenge is always, energy markets are dictated by the prices people are willing to pay. Bitcoin naturally is incentivized to seek out the lowest cost source of energy, which typically is stranded renewables or other forms of energy that are produced in an abundant fashion. And Bitcoin is actually a great load balancer for energy grids because it can consume peak demand generation during periods of low demand and help offtake energy that otherwise would go wasted. So again, if I could just stress any one point with people who are watching, it's very important to separate uses of energy. That's a macro problem, policy driven, very much set at the state level. And again, let's not forget, European Union every year gives $50 billion in direct subsidies to the oil industry, right? So in the US, it's 20 billion of direct subsidies to the oil and gas industry. So the incentives here really matter, and they're hard for the Bitcoin industry to control. And when it comes to uses of energy, it's very difficult to have an objective argument about something that's deeply subjective and in many instances, I think, is deeply personal for people.
So I'm glad, Meltem, that you raised the issue of incentives and the role, for that matter, of subsidies and governments, because this is where I want to go with this, right? So I think that the fact that you are seeing a significant amount of Bitcoin sourcing done with renewables is obviously a positive thing, and that's because renewables at the end of the day should be the cheapest source of energy by definition. But the problem is, of course, as prices rise and margins improve, miners are incentivized to use dirty sources of power because they can make money from this. It's a kind of a neutral exercise. So the question is simply like, how do we get those incentives in the right place? Is that a role for councils like the group that was formed yesterday, or is this something that governments really need to be driving?
I want to first object to the use of the word dirty. I think that's a very loaded word. When we describe energy, like you're using energy right now to power your computer, is that energy dirty? Yeah, so I think
a big chunk of it, yes. It definitely is. I'm not disputing that by any stretch. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so
I have a problem with the whole grid rather than the use of this. I'm like you. I'm concerned about the sources and the policies that drive what our sources are, and how can we use this technology in some respects to drive the changes of that sources.
Sure. So let's be very clear. One of the most important things about the Bitcoin network is that it's decentralized in all aspects. The physical implementation of the Bitcoin network in the form of mining is a very important part of the network, and it's finally starting to get the attention it deserves, in my view. And we're starting to see a lot of financing models and investment going into the physical infrastructure that supports the Bitcoin network, all the way from semiconductor fab in the form of ASIC production through to the actual installation of these miners, to now new co-location and hosting services that are emerging, similar to how the early internet peering or data center business started. And in my view, every business who is serious about Bitcoin should be running its own physical infrastructure. That I think will be a big shift as we move forward into the future. Now they'll use third parties who are experts in that to do it. But here's the most important thing. What we're seeing right now, and one of the things I'm working on at Coinshares, is investing in mining businesses and startup miners who are directly co-locating with renewable energy facilities. But more important than that, they're actually enabling new renewable energy production to come onto the grid by using Bitcoin mining as an economic incentive to make that facility economically viable. And so what's really interesting to me here is if we can use Bitcoin mining as an economic tool to bring more renewables onto the grid, we've just found a really great way to use a private sector solution to solve a failure in public policy. And I think one of the big trends we will see in the energy industry, and again, this is what I did for 7 years before I did Bitcoin for 7 years. One of the big shifts we will see, I think, is a shift towards more decentralized, localized, smaller scale power production. And that's something I'm really excited about. This is something that's been problematic in the US, where renewables cannot be contributed back into the grid. It's very difficult, for people who are producing in excess of renewables to put those into the grid unless they're of a certain size. So I think generally, as we start to see more localized, smaller scale renewable energy production to make that economically feasible or balance those loads with Bitcoin mining, we'll also start to see more resilient energy grids emerge, and in particular, energy grids that could potentially be independent of the fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel industry complex. So there are a lot of interesting shifts afoot, but I think the important thing here is to have calm, rational, fact-based discussions. But unfortunately, when talking about climate these days, it seems very difficult to do that.
Nobody talks about the fact that Bitcoin actually uses more renewables in proportion to its total energy usage compared to most countries around the world. So the worst case estimate that I found was 39%, as Danny Scott here has tweeted. Most countries around the world don't do that well when it comes to using renewable sources. Nobody is talking about that. And again, Bitcoin does provide a service that is valued by the world. Otherwise, nobody would be buying it since day one. So I think this is definitely something that needs to be spoken about.
And to get geographical distribution of these miners from mining pools. Since we get this geographical distribution update, we will be able to look at each individual region energy mix and then get from these figures more or less reliable estimate of energy mix. For example, how much the Sichuan region contributes to the overall equation, and like if we know that 30%, 50 or whatever comes from Sichuan, we can then guess what the energy mix of this region, etc., etc. So, and miners often choose these renewable sources not because of their benevolence or environmental friendliness, but simply because it's the cheapest source of energy. Sometimes it exists in abundance.
Well, thank you both for that insight and for joining us. That was Meltem Demirors, Chief Strategy Officer at Coinshares, and Anton Deck, Research Associate at the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance.